My 12-year-old, he said to me the other day, he said, what's masochism? And then he really surprised me because he said, what's quantitative easing? And I thought, oh, I think it's definitely going to be easier to explain masochism. But I said, oh, it's basically, basically the government printing more money. And he said, do they actually print more money? And I said, no, they don't, no. And he said, well, why did you say they did? And I said, well, because I hoped you'd be happy with that answer. And he said, well, I'm not. So I said, oh okay. Well, as I understand it, after the financial crisis and again during George Osborne's austerity and then again during COVID, basically the Bank of England interest rates, they were so low anyway that they couldn't reduce them any further to stimulate the economy. So what the Bank of England did is they actually bought government bonds off the commercial banks to give them more money that they could then invest, give to other people, stimulate the economy that way. The thing was, though, that they kept on doing that when the economy was picking up anyway, which has led to inflation. So they're now trying to do the reverse of it, quantitative tightening, to try and reduce the inflation that they have partly caused. However, loads of people knew that the Bank of England had all these government bonds that they were going to sell, so the price of government bonds came down, right? So if they did sell them, they were going to make a big fat loss. But if they held on to them, they actually had to pay interest on them at their own Bank of England interest rate, which you may remember recently, they'd upped and upped and upped. So they owed more and more and more. But the Bank of England don't care because the Treasury have said they'll reimburse them. So in answer to your original question, what is quantitative easing? It looks like at the moment it's going to be a transfer of about £200 billion from taxpayers to bankers for a problem originally caused by bankers, for a solution dreamed up by bankers, and then executed very badly by bankers. He said, how come more people aren't angry about this? And I said, well, I think the answer to that is that the only people who really understand it are bankers. And obviously they don't want to talk about it very much, so they just say things like, oh, it's like the government printing more money. And he said, well, why don't you talk about it to your audience? And I said, well, I'm honest, I'm not sure I totally understand it myself. And I have a feeling if I did talk about it to my audience, there's every chance that quite a lot of them would be looking at me quite blank-faced. Going, I hope he talks about biscuits again soon. And he said, you mentioned austerity. He said, what's that? I said, are you sure you wouldn't like a little bit longer on your Nintendo Switch, I said. And he said, no. So I said, oh, OK. Well, basically, after the financial crisis, George Osborne said he wanted to reduce the deficit. And he said that the best way to do this was to basically slash the amount of funding that the government gave to councils by about half, slash the government budget, massively. And as we now know from the International Monetary Fund, all that in fact achieved was it actually steepened the recession, slowed the recovery, killed off growth, raised less revenue, and therefore actually reduced the deficit less quickly. And he said, we've just been learning about the Grenfell fire, and that was partly caused by council cuts. So could we call George Osborne a killer? I said, well, I don't think that would stand up in a court of law, mainly because he slashed the funding to that as well. And he said, also, we've been learning in citizenship studies, he said, that a Prime Minister gets elected for 5 years. But I worked it out, he said, we've had 5 Prime Ministers in 5 years. And I said, well, obviously, it started with David Cameron because he was very confident of winning a vote, so he held a vote and then lost it. Then we had Theresa May projecting herself as a very strong politician, but then hid from a voter. Then we had Boris Johnson, who was accused many, many times of lying about sexual allegations about himself, but amazingly got brought down when he was actually caught lying about a sexual allegation about somebody else. So then we had Rishi Sunak and Liz Truss. They were put to the Conservative members, but they chose Liz Truss, but she turned out to have the shelf life of a kamikaze mayfly. So we then got Rishi Sunak, and he said, well, 5 Conservative Prime Ministers back to back, he said, if they all kept mucking up, why did people keep voting for them? I said, well, that was an example of masochism.